Good afternoon. My name is Kim Gallo, and I am very fortunate to be able to tell you that I am the principal of Shepaug. This is an event that is like no other. It's not a typical high school, and it's not a typical event. Our students prepare position papers on a topic, and they engage in conversation with someone who has lived that topic, who has worked in the realm, and in this case, Mr. Rupp, who has even written about the topic. Most of the times when I go to this event, one of our students or more will make a point that is just so articulate and so salient that I want to stand up like I'm at a football game and say, yeah! And that's what I love about this event, because our students are so articulate, they're so bright, and they're so committed to the work that they do. It shows our school in a very unique and special way, which is really what Shepaug is all about. I deliberately dressed for spring today, and I want you to know that because I wore pink, we are not going to get 12 inches of snow on Tuesday. So, that being said, I would like to introduce you to the coordinator of our event. Am I introducing you? I'd like to introduce you to the mentor to our students and a fine social studies teacher in his own right, Mr. Chris Dennis. Thank you, Chris.
So I want to thank everyone for being here. This is now my 10th or 11th year doing this, and one thing I've realized very quickly, and one of the first things Gene Horrigan told me when he asked me to take over the program was that this is always about kids. And so my tagline this year is really that no adult should ever take responsibility for what you're going to see here today. These are some of the most motivated, self-driven, articulate students that we have to offer, and all kids are in their own right, and this happens to be their realm. So we're thrilled that they've participated in this. I told the kids I actually have very little to say today. Usually I'll make a speech, and I think Matt just rolled his eyes at me for saying that. But with that being said, there are some people I do want to recognize. Really, I want to just recognize people who support this event, starting with the Board of Ed and Kim and Lori Ferreira, our principal and assistant principal, for always supporting and giving us what we need. If I ask for something, we always get it. So, and that's, again, for the kids. The custodial staff does a phenomenal job setting up. They always seek me out in advance and have things taken care of. Ginger, we have some wonderful desserts afterwards and snacks for people, so we hope you'll enjoy those. I also like to thank the Shepaug Student Project Foundation, who has been incredibly supportive both in sponsoring the desserts afterwards and also promoting the event and spreading the word. So really, I know Julie, you're here, and the whole team. Thank you so much for doing that. Sergey Kambalov is here, one of our speakers from 3 years ago. So I want to definitely recognize Sergey, and also Joe Baxter, who does a wonderful job. He's the president of the United Nations Association. He's not here today with us, but we meet with him a couple times a year, and he sets us up with these wonderful people like Dr. Rupp, who we're thrilled that you're here with us. The teachers of Shepaug are outstanding in letting us really pull these kids out for a couple days and formalize their remarks. And of course, Dr. Rupp, thank you for being here. I do want to talk about our student panelists today and just give a few words on them. I think they're remarkable. They're part of the Model United Nations program, which a lot of kids have interest in, usually for the right reasons. They love to go to another city for 4 days and participate. That's great, and they love ideas, but these kids are here on a Saturday with no real skin in the game other than to say, I want to talk about the world, and I want to talk about really hard issues that in some cases feel unsolvable, but talking about them and bringing them to light, I think, brings progress towards those issues. So I'm going to start with our youngest panelists, Wilson and Bridget. I remember last year they came to me expressing interest in the Model UN Club, and with freshmen, I'm never sure, do they know what the Model UN Club is? I remember freshman year, I was just trying to remember to put deodorant on. I'm not really quite sure of the world at large. And I'm like, do they think we're going to build, not them necessarily, but do they know what the club is? And they did, of course. And they participated this year at Harvard with us. They were outstanding delegates. And the club is in really fine hands. And this program, I hope, is in great hands with them in their participation in future years. Jack Roush, I have the pleasure of having in class this year, and he loves ideas and loves to think and loves to debate and loves to argue. It's great. He offers great perspectives, and he's always done his homework. That's what I remember about Jack. And I think Jack will be taking on the Model UN Club next year, along with this program. So we're excited for Jack. Matthew is our senior. He's been part of our club for 2 years, the Model UN Club, and he's been a student panelist in this for 2 years. Another person who loves ideas, who's always done his homework, always done his reading, and you're going to love what Matt has to say today, I'm sure of it. And lastly, Bianca. I can remember 4 years ago in this library, Bianca as a freshman, working on a global studies project, running out to me, asking for advice. And I said, I'm the last person you want to talk to. Most kids do whatever they can to run away from me. You don't really want to have this conversation about world affairs. And she did. And I'll never forget her running out asking about foreign policy and how presidents conduct foreign policy. And I gave her a piece from our textbook from Michael Roskin about the continuity principle that generally presidents follow more or less the foreign policy of their predecessors until 2016, for better or for worse. And I remember that about her, and she's pursued that throughout. So I'm going to turn this thing over to Bianca. Of course, I want to thank Dr. Rupp again for being here, but really this is Bianca's day, our students' day, and also Dr. Rupp's day. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Dennis. I think sometimes he cuts himself a little short of everything he does for us. He's been my teacher for 3 years. I don't have him as a teacher this year, but he is my technical advisor for my senior project. And he's always been there for me, and more of a technical advisor. I'd like to say that he's my mentor, and he keeps me mentally sane sometimes when I overthink a little bit about everything I have to do, and the privilege really that I have of running this program. And I'd like to talk briefly about a couple of weeks ago, I was asked by Ms. Gallo in our administration to talk about what I love about Shepaug. And I answered saying that I'm so glad that even though I go to a very small school in the middle of Washington, Connecticut, that I've been able to have an extremely global education, an international education, due to the programs that we have here, due to Mr. Dennis and the Model United Nations program, due to this, and it's been amazing. And I think all the students on the panel will agree that we've been able to have been opened up to a world that is much bigger than Washington's borders or America's borders. And so today that's what we will be talking about. We're going to be talking about what borders mean and what they mean for a lot of people traveling across them. And so I'd like to thank, to end, Dr. Rupp. He was the president of the International Rescue Committee that had a lot of refugee resettlement programs. So he's extremely qualified to talk about the subject. He was also the ex-president of Columbia University. So I am very glad to introduce Dr. George Rupp.
Well, thank you, Bianca, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, Kim Gallo. It's very nice to hear from all of you, and I thank all of you for coming to this event. I will try to keep my remarks brief enough so that we can hear from all 5 of our panelists, have a chance to interact among ourselves, and then open up and still have enough time for questions from all of you. I know from exchanges by email with Bianca that she's very struck and therefore has been interested in this topic by what I would call the contradiction between the increasingly interconnected world that we have and at the same time the ways in which we're building barriers to try to keep people from realizing those connections. That's not really a contradiction if we focus on it, because it's clear that our interconnected world means that people in the most impoverished areas of the world are aware of what it's like in the less impoverished or the wealthier areas of the world, and not surprisingly have some aspirations to move there. But the fact that we have, even as we celebrate our global interconnections, become increasingly focused on barriers that keep people from making connections across barriers is, I think, something all of us need to face up to, look at carefully, and try to address. And that's what I take this World Affairs Forum to be trying to do. So I will make three groups of points in my opening remarks. First, I would like to give a sense of the scale, the scope of the problem that we're confronting when we talk about the movement of people across barriers. Secondly, I'll spend a little bit of time on refugees themselves, although I will keep that fairly brief, because my sense from looking at the topics that our panel wants to address is that that will become will fill in a lot of details in the course of their remarks. And then a third chunk of my remarks will be on what I think is the most urgent challenge, namely that we as a global community, as a world community, take steps in order to prevent the local conflicts that generate this massive displacement of people that moves across borders. And I may take a little more time on that third point, because it seems to me if we are serious about addressing this issue of displaced people and refugees, we cannot fully do so unless we also look at the conflicts that are generating massive numbers of displaced people. First, then, on the scope of the problem, what I thought I would do is take Syria as an example of really the most recent generator of refugees, but then move to generalize from that to the kind of total numbers involved globally. Syria has a population, had a population before the current civil war erupted, of about 21 million, 21, 22 million. At the moment, of that 21 million, 7 million are displaced from their homes inside Syria. So what in UN lingo would be called internally displaced people. Another 5 million are refugees in the neighborhood. So if you envision a map or look at a map of Syria, that would be Lebanon. Lebanon has a total population of 4 million people, and over 1 million of those are Syrian refugees. That's not counting the refugees from Iraq and the Palestinian refugees. So those of us who think there are a lot of refugees elsewhere in the world, think of Lebanon, over 25% of the population. Jordan, another neighbor, about 650,000 Syrian refugees there. Again, on top of the Iraqi refugees who fled to Jordan in the last iteration. Turkey, over 3 million Syrian refugees. And then finally, Iraq itself, which sent massive numbers of people into Syria and Jordan when it had its civil war, and now is receiving at least a small number, maybe 250,000. Now those 5 million, or over 5 million, are just in the neighbors. We often hear, at least in some of the media in this country, well, why don't some of those people in the neighborhood take care of these refugees? Well, excuse me, 5 million of them are in the immediately contiguous countries to Syria, and they have done a huge amount with very limited resources provided by the rest of the world. And then that leaves about 250,000 refugees who account for all of the publicity that we get about refugees and from Syria who wind up in Europe and in the United States. One of the striking facts just about the way a crisis like this develops is that there was not much attention to the first 4 years of the Syrian civil war, by which time not all, but most of the 5 million refugees were in the neighboring countries. It was only when bodies started to wash up, especially babies' bodies started to wash up on the shores of the Mediterranean, that all of a sudden people said, oh, there's a war going on and there are people who are suffering. So there is a way in which we tend to absolutize the perspective of the developed world, and here in this case, especially of the United States and Europe. But there was a very large problem, both internal to Syria and in the neighborhood, before refugees became an issue in Europe and the United States. Well, that's Syria. If we now back up and look at the scale of the problem for the globe as a whole, there are 65 million displaced people in the world, refugees and other displaced people. That's the most since World War II. It's very substantially higher than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It has continued to grow, and the sad fact is it's unlikely that it's going to decrease in any time in the near future. Now, I find numbers to be concrete, but my dear wife who's here constantly tells me, you know, for most people, numbers are abstract and they don't register. So 65 million people, that's more than the population of the entire United Kingdom. It's more or less the equivalent of Spain and Portugal put together. Or it's twice the population of Canada. So if you think about that many people displaced from their home looking for a new place to settle, we're talking about very large numbers. Now, I should say of the 65 million people, about 25 million are actually refugees in the UN definition, namely that they've crossed a border after leaving to leave their home country. And about 40 million are internally displaced. So in terms of the Syrian example, 40 million are the equivalent of 7 million that are inside Syria, 25 million, I'm using rough numbers, but are the same as the 5.25 million who become refugees. Now, it's very important for us as we think about this crisis for ourselves to know what the proportion of this huge global problem is that actually has an impact directly on the United States. Up until the current administration, there was this presidentially set ceiling on how many refugees the United States would accept. It was higher in the past, in the George W. Bush administration, and before that, and especially in the Carter administration, very much higher. But in recent years, it's been around 100,000, fewer than 100,000, but with a target of about 100,000. And so here again, it's important to recognize what that means in terms of the scale of the global problem. That's 1/7 of 1% of the 65 million people who are displaced. If those of you who enjoy decimals, it's 0.0015. Now, I don't mean this is unimportant, but it's really crucial that we not totalize our own sense of what resettling refugees is about and forget that it's only a teeny little fraction of the total. So that's my first point, the scale of the problem as a whole. Secondly, in terms of refugees themselves, which is what this panel is focusing on, just because the numbers that get resettled in the U.S. or even in Europe, which is larger than the U.S. now for the first time in a long time, but as small as those numbers are given the totals, it's still absolutely critical that we do it well. And as you'll see in the panel discussions, where there's a focus on refugee camps and then on resettling refugees after they leave camps, and that is absolutely important that we do that. It is not that that I'm not trivializing it. I just think we shouldn't think it's the whole solution. Now, as we will hear, when especially I guess when Bridget talks a little bit about the solution for refugee camps, it is crucial that there be security, that there be health care provided, that there be education, that there be building in camps of leadership so that it's not just all outsiders. And similarly, when there's resettlement into a third country, that there again, there's a welcoming reception, there's housing that's available, which normally includes involvement of government, again, healthcare and education, including language instruction for those refugees who have to learn another language, job training and placement. We'll hear Wilson is going to talk about economic assimilation. So the challenge of refugee camps and then resettling refugees is enormously complicated, and we need to focus attention on it. My own view is that refugee camps are the worst of all solutions, except when there's no other solution. Having spent a lot of time in refugee camps, it seems to me urgent that the challenge that we face is to move people from refugee camps as quickly as possible to the next step. That's either when it's safe for them to return to the country they fled from, or to be integrated into the society to which they fled so that they can have jobs and support themselves, or to be resettled in a third country, whether in the United States or in some other country. That's urgently important. We should, in my view, try to do it in less than 20 years. I mean, as I say, if you talk to refugees who've been resettled, many of them have been in camps for up to 20 years. Which is a huge, which is why, of course, it's crucial that there be education and healthcare and all of those services, or else the whole generation is lost. But it nonetheless is a place where people are intentionally left unable to care for themselves because they're not allowed to work. And so they're, in a sense, become dependent, and therefore the shorter that stay can be, the better. And I'm sure we will have some discussion of that with the panel. Now, that brings me to the third set of issues I would like to at least open up and mention, namely, as crucial as it is that we care for refugees in refugee camps and help to get them resettled, I think it's even more urgent that we as a global community work to prevent the conflicts that are generating all of these refugees. And there, we know a lot of what needs to be done, but we simply are not doing it, and not doing it nearly effectively enough. Matt is probably going to spend some time talking about conflict resolution, and I think that's terrific. I think it's clear that we have much to learn from that. But I'd like to just mention 3 lessons that I think we need to learn, and these lessons are based on my own work at the International Rescue Committee. The first lesson is that from the very beginning of any involvement in countries that have either actual or the potential for conflicts, it's critical to build local capacity. And in the case of the International Rescue Committee, we have 12,000 staff around the world, well, actually more now, 12,000 when I was there, and 98% of the ones who are outside of the U.S., where we resettle refugees, and therefore indigenous population is the Americans. But outside the U.S., 98% of those 12,000 staff are local people. They know the community, they know the language. We work very hard in the beginning of any kind of intervention to train more of them so that they can be effective. In any case, one of the lessons that too often is not learned is that these countries can flourish better if their own people are trained rather than if outsiders are brought in. The second lesson is that sound governance is crucial. And I will resist the temptation of telling many, many stories about this, but I can only mention during my time at the IRC, I visited Afghanistan half a dozen times, Sudan half a dozen times, the Congo half a dozen times, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Myanmar, any place, as I often said to people on our staff, and any place where shit happens, we were involved there, and I wound up having a chance to see it. And based on those first-hand observations as well as lots of reading, it seems to me crystal clear that there is no way of preventing the kind of dislocation and conflict that we have unless there is decent government. And this is a lesson that's really important for the United States to learn, because much of our rhetoric talks about the less government, the better. Well, let me tell you, if you've been in places where there's too little government, where there isn't even sort of basic security for anybody, then all of a sudden it's hard not to recognize the reasons why further government might be necessary. So, second lesson, sound governance is crucial. And the third lesson, which is really the theme that I have for this third part of my remarks, is that catastrophe prevention is enormously more effective than emergency intervention. And this can take multiple forms. I think Matt might talk a little bit about peacekeeping, but in any case, it's clear that if we had clearer mandates, more resources, earlier intervention, peacekeeping could be much more effective than it has tended to be. Trade is a very important way of avoiding the development of conflict. And here, the developed world, the rich world, is really culpable. The last global round of trade negotiations, the so-called Uruguay round, came to a very clear deal that the developed world, the rich world, would stop subsidizing its exports to the poor world, to the developing world, and in exchange, the developing world, the poor world, would lower any kind of barriers, trade barriers that it had. Now, the developing world lived by its part of the bargain. There are very low tariffs that are imposed on imports to those countries. But the developed world, and in particular the United States, did not live at all up to our part of the bargain. So we still subsidize agricultural exports. Just give you one example, cotton grown in the United States, inferior to what can be grown in West Africa, is imported in huge amounts in West Africa, undermining the local agricultural population, because we subsidize farmers, including the shipment of that grain to West Africa. You can multiply that by lots of others. But when you hear arguments for trade, one of the key features that has to be achieved is that the developing world, the poor world, is not victimized by the rich world as it consistently has in the trade agreements that we have so far had. So peacekeeping, trade, two ways. Third way to develop or to work at prevention is international development. Obviously, trade can be part of that, but international development is an area where it is mind-boggling how uninformed, especially Westerners, especially Americans, are about it. So let me just give you a little bit of data. In 1996, I realize that's before you all were born, so I know it's going way back in history, but some people in the room will remember that Bill Clinton was president then. At the World Food Summit, 1996, there was an agreement among the developed countries that all should aspire to achieve 0.7% of the gross national product as contributions to international development. Not a little less than 1%, 0.7%. Now, that wasn't a hugely ambitious project. The leading countries in the world of international development were already above that. So Denmark, Sweden, Holland were at over 1% at that. So they were a little above the benchmark. But other countries, including in particular the U.S., were way behind. So that was an affirmation that was set out explicitly in 1996, and the Clinton administration bought into it, although we didn't make much progress. When George W. Bush became president in 2002, in 2000, but he went. There was another meeting held, a really crucial meeting in Monterrey, Mexico, and at the 2002 meeting in Monterrey, Mexico, President Bush, but just before the meeting started, announced that the U.S. would double its international development aid. And that was very well received, and everyone applauded. And it has to be said, George W. Bush deeply believed in the importance of that. And those of you who lived through the Bush II administration might remember that he launched a couple of initiatives. The PEPFAR initiative, the President's Emergency Intervention for to combat HIV/AIDS, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a whole new entity that was going to bring development work. So Bush was really serious about that and worked very hard at it. But now, if you've listened this far, let me give you the figures. If Americans are asked how much of the U.S. Budget goes to international development, let's just say of the federal budget, they'll say sometimes 25%, more or less, but the average comes out something like 10% is what they assume is the case. So here, let me give you some numbers. And I don't mean to ask you to take notes, but if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, write them down. Write these numbers down, because they will blow the minds of almost anybody that you describe them to. Okay, I'm not picking arbitrary years, but I started being interested in this when I was at Columbia, and I got only more interested in it as I was at the International Rescue Committee. In 1948, at the height of the Marshall Plan, right, where we were helping to rebuild the countries that had been at war with us, especially Japan and Germany. In 1948, 18% of the federal budget went to international development. 18%. That's where we all have the illusion about how generous we are. So that, because the economy was much smaller, that was 2.6% of the gross domestic product as a whole. 1948, 1962. Kennedy era, when some new initiatives also were begun, Peace Corps and other such initiatives. That number had come down by a factor of 6. So 1962, 3% of the federal budget. And I'm not picking a low point here because the Kennedy, but it's just part of a trajectory. 3%, which is 0.6%. Of the gross domestic product. Now remember, the target at the Monterey meetings and at the World Food Summit was 0.7. So in 1962, we were close to the target that was set later on. Okay, then 2016, the last year for which we have data. 1% of the federal budget goes to international assistance, and 0.2% of the gross domestic product, 0.2%. So that's just to make sure we're clear about that. That's out of $10, that's 2 pennies. The most generous countries in the world are giving a dime out of $10. I mean, it's not as if there are a whole lot more, but we're giving 2 cents out of $10. I won't bore you with my speculations about what these numbers might look like in 2020 if current patterns continue. But in any case, we are at less than a third of the goal that we have set for ourselves. And if I can just give a comparison, the United Kingdom, at the time of the Monterey Consensus, was also just about at where we were, maybe a little more than 0.2%. And Tony Blair committed that they would catch up. They would make it to 7%. They're now at 0.6. So they've tripled in the years since the Monterey Consensus in 2002. And we, with great struggles, with real efforts on the part of George W. Bush, less efforts since then, partly because Congress has not been supportive, we're stuck at 0.2%. So I'm sorry for that long exposition on international assistance, but if we want to solve the larger problem, we have to come closer to doing, the United States, to doing our fair share in terms of international development assistance. So, in summary then, there are no final solutions to this global challenge of refugees and displaced people, but the ones that we need to be working on are, first of all, resettlement in the country of refuge or a third country, or return home when it's safe to go back, or, and I think here best of all, prevention of local conflicts before they generate the kind of displaced people that we're trying to help to find new homes. Thank you all very much.
So I hope this works. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rupp. I'm going to be talking about globalization and the refugee crisis and focusing a lot on how this is reflected in the European Union. So, a group of 28 countries that operates as a cohesive economic and political bloc, formed in hopes to achieve unity amongst bordering nations while promoting the advancement of each and the harmony of the whole. This is the premise of the European Union. Yet, as a humanitarian crisis faces this bloc, instead of working in unison, this entity has proven to become increasingly divided. The validity of what some might call a pipe dream is largely being questioned, yet the instability and current dichotomy of the EU should make all of us question the effects and solutions to this refugee crisis and what they mean for an uber-national body. Since the beginning of a dream of a united European community with a common market decades ago, and since its official establishment in 1993, the Union has been a pillar and worldwide example of a globalized project, constantly promoting the development of an increasingly integrated global economy and furthering the proven logic that nations who are more united are in turn safer. In fact, as the homepage of the EU website still outlines, countries that trade with one another become economically interdependent and so more likely to avoid conflict. Yet the EU has not solely attempted to be a trading bloc. One of the most important policies this union passed early on in its history was the decision to open borders between EU states so people could live, work, and freely travel across most of the continent. Yet European reactions and policies relating to the migrant crisis have made this body, which has constantly championed globalization and open borders, contradict its very goals and ideals. As we can see in this map, all the bold borders are where a lot of countries are planning to build fences or walls to block refugees from coming in, countries that promise to open their borders. So instead of working together in cooperation to fight this threat as a united body, European member states have been pursuing self-serving and discordant migration policies. However, even though difficult in a time when nationalist sentiments are fragmenting Europe, a comprehensive EU initiative to tackle the crisis should still remain prioritized. As George Soros states, the refugee crisis is not a one-off event. It augurs a period of higher migration pressures for the foreseeable future. Due to a variety of causes, including climate change, the depletion of natural resources, the demographic and economic imbalances between Europe and Africa, and unending conflicts in the broader region. These fragmented migration policies, such as building border fences, will not only further fragment the Union, they also seriously damage European economies and subvert global humanitarian standards. As countless studies show, a stronger border and asylum agencies alone cost upwards of 15 billion euros for the EU. And as an increased amount of European politicians campaign for an abandonment of the Schengen system, which allows for these open borders between the EU, many forget this would cost between 47 billion and 140 billion euros in GDP loss each year. However, any time we have seen an attempt at a European agreement and steps for a united plan, it has never been truly European, and it has often been extremely flawed. The best example is the agreement between the Union and Turkey, negotiated almost single-handedly by the loudest European voices to stem refugee flow from the eastern Mediterranean under the flawed premise that asylum seekers can legally re-enter Turkey. Not only was this negotiation deeply underfunded, it also imposed involuntary quotas and considered a country on the premises of a coup d'etat a safe haven. Yet the largest dangerous precedent this agreement began was the idea that refugee rights can be traded for economic or political favors. This idea is now being followed in policies between the Union and Africa, which can lead to a dangerous spiral that will probably not lead to a developed Africa which can safely and efficiently accept refugees, which is what Europe effectively wants. Also, the idea that if you as a nation help keep refugees out of Europe, then your decision will not be held to the same level of accountability is an extreme moral wrong. Europe cannot come up with short-term solutions under the false idea that they are unilaterally approved by the Union. Coalitions of the willing could be established to restructure European policy and the European budget. As a foreign policy article states, the EU stands out for having a remarkably low amount of debt, given the size of its budget. It should therefore leverage this budget like all sovereign governments in the world do, including the US and a lot of the governments inside the Union. The European Union should tap into its untouched resources instead of continuously taking out insufficient funds every year for the refugee problem. Ideally, Europe should have one unanimous refugee policy, yet since that is a far-off dream, legislation efforts to establish a European border and coast guard should be furthered, and these projects have already begun, along with the intensive budget reforms. Maintaining unfair systems which serve as the basis of determining which country bears responsibility for processing and hosting asylum seekers prevents solidarity within Europe. And at a time when these refugees, people seeking asylum from a war-torn and inhospitable country, as Dr. Rupp talked about, they are dramatizing the divide within the European Union, politically, as I've talked about. We should not forget that the ideological impacts that they are having on the European populace are just as important. Due to failures in European integration of refugees caused by countless domestically centered policies, a project made to further our increasingly globalized world is being plagued by the nationalistic voices of far-right parties. The ideological divide on the general threat posed by refugees is 30% in most EU nations. 60% of those on the far right see refugee as a major threat, while only 30% on the left share this concern, according to a Pew Research study. Meaning that the political divide between the European left and the European right is growing, and that is clearly reflected in people's opinions of migrants. European politicians and people should realize that closing countries off from one another in this union is not a beneficial outcome or solution to the current humanitarian crisis. It leaves the parts wandering aimlessly without their whole. Yet forcing quotas and spearheading agreements isn't the answer to a more stable solution. The European Union is globalized in all aspects, besides in the way it is handling this current migrant crisis. Yes, countless countries inside and outside of the European Union have for long had a domestically centered outlook, which allows these nationalistic policies to gather support. However, using a humanitarian crisis as a political tool to further one's campaign and to call upon deep-rooted xenophobic sentiments contradicts not only Europe's but our world's globalized project. The flood of refugees is a necessary and inevitable step of economic globalization. Capital worth flows freely across borders, good moves to other nations as continuous imports, and now, inevitably, people for political and economic reasons are migrating into nations where they see a more prosperous future for themselves. I believe that we can't fight the inevitable wave of the modern world, and therefore we cannot fight globalization. Thank you. And
I'd like to thank Bianca for her speech. I'm Matthew Marchese, and I'm going to be talking about conflict regions, which is a topic that Mr. Rupp touched on. So, the root of the refugee crisis is conflict. When we look at all of the regions that refugees are leaving in droves, they are all regions of conflicts. Places where we see some of the worst humanitarian disasters since the collapse of Yugoslavia. As I am sure most of you know, there is no place where this is more true than Syria. So to solve this issue at its source is to stop the roots of these conflicts and the conflicts that already exist. The causes usually lie in basic needs and ideological differences in civilian parties. Ideological differences are very clear here. Most people do not want to live under a regime that oppresses them for their ethnicity, for their different opinions, or a regime that simply takes actions that they do not agree with. Most of these conflicts start with shouts of liberty and an end to corruption. Also, when these conflicts break out, many different ideological groups vying for power are quick to take advantage of the absence of government. But the lack of basic necessities plays a huge role, possibly even a bigger one than the ideological differences. People are usually way more contented to live in an authoritarian regime if they have access to food, shelter, and water. But when something like that is taken away, people want change. People's ideological differences and lack of basic resources push them to go and protest. Protests are usually met with gunshots, and understandably, the people fire back. In the case of Syria, on July 10, 2000, Bashar al-Assad was elected from an unopposed ballot. He began to take some reforms, giving hopes to a more open regime than his father's, but these hopes were quickly squashed. To a lot of people, Assad represented a possible change, possibly more openness in their government, and he quickly destroyed these hopes. Resentment built up. Ideological differences between the Alawite government of Syria and the multicultural groups in the country only worsened. Syrian people began to call for liberty, only emboldened by other movements in the Middle East that were seemingly successful. While all of this was happening, from 2006 to 2011, Syria saw one of the world's worst droughts in recent history. According to the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, the most vulnerable Syrians dependent on agriculture suffered from nearly 75% crop failure. Assad at this time was desperate to shift economic growth into the urban sector, and he cut subsidies for agriculture greatly. This had a drastic effect on the lives of millions of Syrians, rubbing salt into their wounds. Some flooded the cities, but there, living in absolute poverty with an inability to feed their family, they only became more discontented with their government. Between the authoritarianism of Assad and his failure to support his own people in time of need, conflict broke out. Moving on to today, the conflict itself can become very messy very quickly. Even if it becomes resolved, the power vacuum afterwards can spell disaster. The desperation on all sides pushed them into actions that make these people flee. Assad released jihadists from prison to tinge rebel groups with extremism. Assad's desperate attempt to hold onto power has pushed him to gas his own people and slaughter civilians en masse. Rebel groups lacking any sort of real resources are completely void of any central authority. Jihadists and Islamic extremists, backed into a corner, lash out with no real regard for human decency. The problem with the disunited Syrian conflict is best described by Bassama Kodmani, head of the Arab Reform Initiative, who states, "On the ground, too many players want a continuation of the conflict. IS and other jihadis, the regime's special forces and its other militias, and warlords on both sides, Those who want an end to the war are the weakest, the local groups with no ideological agenda who are rooted in their communities and still defending the original objectives of the uprising, freedom, social justice, and end to dictatorship. And the overwhelming majority of civilians who have nobody to represent them." This is an issue not only with the Syrian conflict, but with conflicts that people are fleeing from. The quagmire that is the Syria provokes a real moral dilemma for the United States. The ideal situation in this war is that all regional and world powers pull out support and force a transitional government to be established where both sides make concessions and jihadists are excluded. But this plan is just that, only ideal. Banking on the Russians and the Saudis for withdrawing support is anything but pragmatic. The conflict is now so fragmented that it seems that only the complete destruction of one side is the only solution. The moral dilemma here is this: does the United States continue to fund rebels with little central authority that have an unlikely probability of winning the war, or do they make concessions with a man who gasses his own people? This presents a fundamental problem with United States intervention. The U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. It has cemented itself as the most moral force of all the major world powers. Yet, at the same time, the United States is so much better at toppling regimes than it is of building governments. Let's look at the case of Libya. The U.S. was there to topple Gaddafi, and the rebels won and established a government. To much of the world's relief, they elected moderates into office, but where was the United States after that? The U.S. was so intervening when it came to drone-striking government strongholds, yet stepped back when it came to Libya's domestic issues. If the U.S. was there, or pushed someone to be there, to establish central authority and political parties quicker, the nation of Libya would be a success of the Arab Spring and not one of its many failures. The U.S. can no longer expect a stable government to simply be established in these regions. Governments take time, and democracies take even longer. The United States, as the world's most powerful nation, has created its own obligation to help these people and the nations they form. So if anything is to be learned from the Syrian conflict, it is that the issues must be combated before they happen, to force leaders to make concessions with their people and to be working on the underlying pressures in a nation rather than just waiting for them to boil over. It is often late and weak intervention by both sides that only serve to prolong the conflict instead of solve it. When a regime is toppled, the United States needs to be there to rebuild, because if they aren't, things are bound to fall apart. I cannot stand here and act like I know how the Syrian conflict will end or how to solve it, but we can only learn from the failures here, from the tensions that started it to the humanitarian crisis we face today, that we can prevent even more disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm Jack Roush, again, as you all know. I'm going to be talking about stateless people. I don't think anyone has brought that up yet, but that was the topic I chose to focus on for the forum. The Faili Lurs are a Shiite people closely related to the Kurds, who have lived on the western foothills of the Zagros Mountains in Iraq and Iran since the 2nd century BC. The Failis had their citizenship in Iraq revoked as an ethnicity in 1980 by the Ba'ath Party, immediately rendering almost 300,000 people unable to access public records and services, unable to participate in government, and unable to prove the most basic of information, such as birth, childbirth, marriage, and residency. Some Failis were able to gain citizenship in Iran, while others were able to forge Iranian citizenship in Iraq, with most becoming stateless. This led to the Failis becoming an untouchable caste, effectively sentenced to lives of unskilled labor and desperation as they became non-existent in the eyes of the Ba'athist regime. Through the stroke of a pen, an ancient culture was nearly destroyed. This humanitarian tragedy continued until 2006, when the decree of 1980 was voided, allowing upwards of 200,000 Failis to regain Iraqi citizenship. However, the process of regaining citizenship has been arduous, with total reintegration almost impossible, according to the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. Today, an unknown number of Failis remain stateless. The fate of the Faili Lur people is unfortunately not unique. Today, 12 million people are stateless, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That said, it is important to note the distinction between refugees and stateless people. Stateless people and refugees are both persecuted. However, most refugees are not stateless, and almost all stateless people are unable to become refugees in any official capacity. Stateless people in conflict regions cannot gain asylum in stable nations, as they have no registration of birth, nationality, and other necessary documentation. Additionally, refugees may become stateless should their papers expire, be lost, or otherwise voided. Refugee families give way to stateless children, as transient families are unable to register births and marriages. Across the Middle East and North Africa, thousands of babies are born stateless annually on account of archaic laws based in Islam, where single mothers are unable to transfer their citizenship to their children, even if that child is born as a result of rape or forced marriage. And in this region, conflicts threaten the citizenship of long-oppressed minority groups, like the Tuareg and the Yazidis, as political instability heightens ethnic tensions. Statelessness and the ongoing refugee crisis in the Middle East created by the conflicts in Syria and Iraq have a close relationship. According to the Brookings Institute, this has led to the vast majority of refugee children in Syria and Lebanon being stateless. Reuters states that at least 50,000 stateless children have been born in the past 4 years in ISIS-occupied territory alone. The rectification of growing statelessness amongst the Middle East's refugee community is considered an obligation for the international community by the United Nations and the Human Rights Watch, not only because it threatens to destroy families and render repatriation of refugees impossible, but because it poses an immense threat to the West's ability to combat terror. Background checks for refugees who are without documentation proves nearly impossible, and the proliferation of forged documents to these people threatens the abilities of both intelligence agencies and humanitarian organizations alike. There have been numerous attempts by the international community to combat statelessness and to allow citizenship to be granted by mother alone throughout the world. The Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness in 1961 attempted to uphold the most basic human rights of stateless people and to grant nationality based on the nation in which a person is born. However, this has remained ineffective in times of strife and political conflict and is an idyllic goal rather than a reality. Similarly, the universally recognized Convention on the Rights of the Child fails to mandate that mothers alone may transfer citizenship, allowing a major humanitarian crisis to grow across the Middle East. Yet, there are most certainly other ways to ease the issue of statelessness and to mitigate future crises with both historic and recent precedents. The UNHCR, for instance, through providing legal assistance, claims to have reduced the number of stateless people by 4 million in the last 10 years alone. This body must be encouraged to increase its legal activities and must be given protection to do so in crisis regions. Nations with large refugee populations must be encouraged to develop their civil registries and administrative infrastructure, such as what Jordan has done with international aid, allowing for over 70% of babies born into refugee families to be granted registration. Reaching refugees outside of camps continues to be a problem for Jordan, though future development in this field continues to expand their capacity. This is a good start, and with more international cooperation, it could expand to other nations bordering this crisis zone. States in the Middle East and North Africa must be convinced to allow mothers to transfer their citizenship. This policy was recently enacted in Morocco, and since then, the number of stateless people has been reduced to negligible levels, according to the Harvard Human Rights Journal. Such a policy would not only reduce statelessness due to this cause, but it would also grant greater dignity to women who are often already oppressed in the region. Lastly, international conventions have, as stated, sought to reduce statelessness in the past, and I believe that it is necessary to amend these conventions for the 21st century, especially with regards to citizenship being granted on nation of birth. Such a policy was enacted by the nations of Europe with regards to the Roma people, which has greatly increased the ability of these people to integrate into European society and for law enforcement to intervene into these communities when necessary. The battle against statelessness is a key factor in resolving the world's largest ongoing refugee crisis and is absolutely necessary in the war on terror. The issue often receives little recognition for its importance, yet it remains unsolved even in this interconnected era. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bridget Snyder, and I'm talking about solutions to refugee camps. So just to explain the picture I chose for a quick second. These circles represent the 10 largest camps in the world, and the size of the circle means there are more people living within them. And so mainly I'm going to be talking where you can see the largest circle today, which is the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. Refugee camps have always been a foundational aspect of international aid and focus. Although the reliance on refugee camps internationally has decreased, there are still millions of people inhabiting them. The most populous is the Kenyan Dadaab refugee camp with 5 different sections that rest near the border between Somalia and Kenya. The combined population estimates vary vastly due to registration facilities being closed in 2011, but it's in approximately 350,000 to 500,000, and 90% of these refugees are Somali. Out of the 1,009 refugees interviewed by the French NGO non-governmental organization MSF, 41% said their shelters did not protect them from rain. The UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has played an active role in giving refugees more adequate shelters. With the shelters provided by the UNHCR, the number of refugees left unprotected by rain decreases by 20%. Because of the insecurity and violence at camp, many aid organizations have stopped going there altogether, and MSF was forced to close many of its facilities. Hunger is another chronic issue when so many refugees live in one area. In the most populous region of the camp, Dagahali, 1 in 10 children are acutely malnourished according to MSF findings, and according to their hospital records, an average of 49 children are sent to their medical facilities every month due to starvation. In order to encourage aid organizations to return, MSF states there must be a reduction of violence. The Kenyan government must assure the safety of refugees in order to ease its own burden. This can be done through increased security measures or more collaboration with UNHCR about the increasing need for registration and security. With increased access to camp, UNHCR can provide more supplies and aid to the people within the camp. Of those interviewed, 10% had to leave the camp to find firewood, and 11% said they had no access to latrines. And this number increased with women to 26%.
Refugees who are forced to leave the camp to use a bathroom or collect firewood are in increased danger of assault, rape, and kidnapping. Without the security, though minimal, that is provided on camp, refugees are putting themselves at risk to carry out very basic tasks. There are also the negative environmental effects of having refugees scavenging for firewood and leaving unmonitored human waste on the ground. To prevent the contamination of the surrounding area and the further endangerment of refugees, there can be a focus on adding more communal latrines instead of household individual-based ones. Despite the problems that have persisted in Dadaab, 86% of the interviews were not willing to return to Somalia. Some possible long and short-term solutions include resettling refugees to a separate nation country to avoid further overcrowding, adjusting size of population limits of the camp by spreading camps further apart, or developing more economic opportunities for refugees living in camps. The Za'atari refugee camp in Jordan has managed to find solutions that allow refugees more self-sufficiency by partnering with NGOs and international governments enabling refugees to resettle and find work. With a population of 77,000 Za'atari, according to the Refugee Council USA, there arises the issue of how to process waste at the camp. In this camp, which is ran jointly by the Jordanian government and UNHCR, there is a cash for work program in place. By having the refugees collect recyclable waste themselves and selling it to a private entity or entrepreneur, these governments and organizations have managed to find a successful short-term solution for a growing population. Projects similar to this could be implemented in Dadaab if an entity is willing to purchase these materials. Programs like this one should be encouraged throughout camps internationally because of their beneficial end products. A refugee with the ability to earn money and a business able to make profit. There are also housing projects that exist in Jordan that provide an alternative to living inside a camp for long periods of time. The housing project in urban Jordan has thus far created 3,800 housing units for 8,700 refugees. But this project also presented the issue of driving up the real estate prices throughout the area and having refugees feel unwelcome by locals due to the strain on the resources there. Refugee-run local organizations tend to have a more sustainable solution that entail education, housing, and assimilation, like the Young African Refugees for Integral Development, otherwise known as YARID. YARID, which was founded in Uganda in 2008, is run by a refugee from the DRC. They aim to teach incoming refugees English, provide a community that speaks their native tongue, and eventually integrate them into Ugandan society. They do this through offering English courses, vocational schools, sports activities, and technology innovation classes. Unfortunately, organizations like this, though highly successful, receive little international support and funding in comparison to Cash for Work and Cash for Rent programs as stated previously. One of the biggest problems with the Dadaab refugee camp is that there are generations. The camp is an estimated 25 years old, living their entire lives on a camp with little access to education, never mind guaranteed access to basic necessities such as food, medicine, and shelter. As more refugees flood the camp and stretch the already scarce resources, many turn to violence out of desperation. Before any long-term solutions can be installed, as I stated previously, the key step that must be taken in Dadaab is that the safety of these refugees is protected and ensured by the Kenyan government. Once the situation becomes more stabilized, more aid organizations will be able to return and lessen the burden of the Kenyan government. Without a targeted effort for the removal of al-Shabaab from Dadaab, refugees and Kenyans are endangered alike. Although this is a lofty goal, no progress can be made in these camps until the violence is under control. Internationally, there should be a focus on the support of smaller organizations whose focus is on rehabilitation and eventual assimilation. They are beneficial to refugees everywhere, not just those residing in camps. Organizations such as YARID provide a more direct support system that refugees can interact with and form bonds with, encouraging them to help the organization after they've become fully assimilated. Organizations like this are also very successful because they are primarily volunteer-based without the bureaucracy that comes with the collaboration with multiple large entities. Refugee camps provide a safe haven to many people internationally, but the international community must stop relying on developing nations to host the majority of refugees in such vast amounts that it is nearly impossible to guarantee the safety and access to basic necessities. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Bridget, for that excellent speech. I'm Wilson King, and I will be talking about today, firstly, the economic impacts of refugees, and then as well as the imbalance today between the number of refugees accepted and the size of the economy of the destination country. So, across Europe and North America, political movements emphasizing economic nativism have expanded in response to worries of refugee incorporation to the Western market. Policies such as quotas and tariffs have been put into place to protect the developed world's populace from job loss and diminished wages, but the assumptions from which these originate are based on the false pretenses that refugees are unskilled and therefore unproductive laborers, as well as the idea that refugees are an economic burden. The validity of these assumptions is largely based on the economic makeup of the destination country. Destination countries with more fledgling economies are subject to economic strain in response to refugees. In past years, Jordan has spent $8.2 billion of their public budget on sustaining their inflow of refugees and has seen only $5.8 billion in growth or tax revenues in return. With a smaller population and economy, Jordan does not possess the resources needed to adequately enable refugees with workplace skills and has therefore been unfairly subjected to accepting such a large amount of refugees. In addition, Jordan's already limited water supply has been strained further by the inflow of people. On the contrary, studies by Foreign Policy have shown that within 5 years of entrance into the United States, a refugee is likely to have produced about double the original investment the country extended in GDP growth or income tax revenues. This prospect is largely contingent upon their entrance into a nation with the original economic stability necessary to extend those funds to accept them. Nations such as Jordan and Greece have felt their already indebted economies retract under the current crisis, whereas populous, wealthy nations such as Germany, France, or the US have felt little impact. It is estimated by The Economist that for the first 6 years of a refugee's stay in the EU or US, an average of 20% of their income is provided by some form of government program, a number which shrinks to approximately 4% after their 20th year. In order for nations to properly assimilate refugees into their native economies, it is absolutely essential that they be enabled with skills in languages and trades. Without this, refugees would be forced into economic pockets of sorts, rather than be fully incorporated into the Western economy. According to International Monetary Fund's Managing Director Christine Lagarde, the EU as a whole should increase its annual growth rate from 1.5 to 1.7% by 2020 in response to incoming refugees, who will account for only 0.37% of the European Union's entire population. Unfortunately, the distribution of this 0.37% of the Europeans' entire population is lopsided, with nations such as Greece accepting a large portion of these people. Wealthier nations must begin to accept a greater proportion of these to ensure that refugees are far more evenly distributed. Nevertheless, this growth does not come through the replacement of native workers. Massimiliano Colli and other trade economists at the World Bank have stated that instead, refugee employment actually pushes natives out of low-paying jobs into positions requiring more skill with higher salaries. It is estimated by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that 82% of refugees accepted into Germany over past years held no form of tertiary education and therefore were considered low-skilled. An influx of low-skilled laborers can quickly lead to an oversaturation of that labor market, therefore causing diminished wages. The Bank of England estimates that thus far, refugees have led to 0.5% of the decrease in wages. However, precedent has shown that refugees do not stay in such jobs and natives do not stay unemployed. Throughout the 1970s, Vietnamese refugees pushed out of their nation in response to the fall of Saigon now hold a higher employment rate and average salary than American natives, and Syrian refugees to the United States are wealthier and more educated than the Vietnamese were. Whereas the Vietnamese were considered to be lowly, quote-unquote, boat people by nativists of the time, Syrian refugees to the United States are required to pay airfare to the country and therefore must have some form of substantial wealth. This is presumed to help them assimilate into the United States economy more quickly. The Refugee Services Collaborative of Greater Cleveland has also released studies revealing that refugees are almost 2 times more likely than natives to open businesses. The 4,800 refugees currently living in the city of Cleveland, 21% of whom are Bhutanese, have created a total of 650 new jobs, combating the rapid population loss of the impoverished zones of the city and stimulating their rapidly declining housing market through the purchase of 248 new homes. Refugees also have the ability to reverse many of the demographic issues involved with many Western economies. Most nations in the European Union have been experiencing slowly aging populations as fertility rates drop. Refugees can be greatly beneficial towards reducing the percent of GDP directed towards state-provided pensions for that reason. All but 3.2% of Syrian refugees are of working age or younger, and therefore can very well offset this aging population. Not only that, but younger refugees generally provide their destination countries with a greater return on investment, as they will be working in that nation, paying income taxes for a longer period of time. While refugees' economic benefits are largely understated, Western politicians are still having to drastically change their monetary platforms in response to popular tides of nativism in response to them. The philosophies of populist leaders such as Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, and Donald Trump spreading anti-immigration policies have become ever more popular among those whose economic situation has deteriorated. But that deterioration is both dramatized and not the fault of the few refugees their nations did accept. Germany has introduced legislation banning asylum seekers from competing with natives for jobs, and movements have spurred championing the dissolution of the European Union. Yet all of this is far more of an overreaction than a logical response to tough economic times. With patience, refugees are an economic benefit, supporting economic longevity, not attackers on the success of the Western world. So, as future legislation is passed and elections between isolationists and globalists are resolved, the question should be answered as to whether or not the West will cower in the face of economic change or pursue a more dynamic, successful future for the workers of the world. Thank you.
So, is this on? Oh, good. At this time, we have about 30 to 45 minutes where we can have a dialogue between the students and Dr. Rupp, and I'll leave it to you guys to facilitate it. And any audience participation is encouraged as well. You'll find the kids not only very well prepared in their responses, but also in how they will respond to what they anticipated to be questions that might derive from their remarks. Two quick logistical things I should have mentioned before, I'm sorry. If you need a restroom, you can head straight down. On the right is for the men, on the left is for women, and we're working on the heat too to try to bump it up a few degrees, so thank you.
Well, let me suggest we first have a little interaction among the panel members, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you. Let me suggest a chain that connects your various comments, and then I'm going to ask any of you to suggest ways of moving up links in the chain. At the bottom, Jack, I think are stateless people. I mean, they're happy if they even get recognition as being acceptable as refugees. Next link in the chain is the whole, Bridget, the areas you discussed, namely refugee camps and the ways in which they do and don't serve people and how they could do that better. Matt, it seems to me that after hearing all the rest of this, the conflict, those who are still in the conflict situation are probably at least no worse off than the people who are refugees, and certainly better off than the stateless ones. And then sort of at the top of the pyramid, we have Wilson and Bianca with their robust confidence that, in fact, refugees can be integrated into a global society in a positive way. Now, question for each of you or all of you is there something to that kind of chain link hierarchy? And if so, how can we work at getting people to move up in the direction that at this point Bianca and Wilson are recognizing from the really more desperate situation that stateless people or refugees have?
Okay, well, even though I guess I'm at the top of the chain, I'll say something.
Well,
So-
you share the top of the chain with Wilson.
Right. So I think that obviously there's questions of whether, what Wilson and I are talking about is the most effective way to, or the best end goal. And I mean, obviously, Wilson and I presented why we think a globalized world and an economically interconnected world with the help of refugees or while aiding refugees is necessary. But at the same time, I kind of want to ask Jack to talk about stateless people and to talk about how you think and whether you think and how easily you think they will transfer into refugee camps, and whether you think the majority of them will have the opportunity to transfer in those refugee camps.
So I assume you're talking about refugees, stateless people rather, who are in the Middle East, for instance,
Right.
because there are lots of stateless people who are not refugees, who I didn't touch on during my speech. So when it comes to the Middle East, I think that stateless people are lucky to become refugees if they get the chance. But the biggest issue with stateless people is that they don't exist on paper. These people were never born, never lived anywhere, never married anyone, never had any children. So the issue is that they need to get some kind of legal recognition in countries like Syria, but also in countries where they're living, third countries such as Jordan and Lebanon. And so the way that you would do that is by giving them temporary registrations, like a temporary work permit or something. And that's very difficult to accomplish because it requires a whole legal framework that doesn't exist currently outside of Jordan. And even in Jordan, it's not very effective because they've only gotten 70% of babies registered. So we need to pump more funding to the UNHCR and more focus into legal representation, because these people require legal representation in these countries because they can't get it, because they don't exist. So they need to prove that they are who they say they are, and that requires legal representation.
Let me make a suggestion about the way we proceed here. All of us, certainly displaced people and refugees and stateless people, are victimized by the definitions that are imposed on all of them. We have the problem with the stateless is the worst, and you rightly have focused attention on that. But for internally displaced people, they also don't qualify for assistance from the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees because they have to have crossed the national border in order to receive that. From the experience I've had on the ground, these definitions are consistently do not serve the interests of the people who are being defined and only serve the interests of people who are wanting to constrain them in various ways. So I would say it's not only the definition of stateless versus refugees and internally displaced people, but also the distinction between internally displaced people and refugees that create even greater problems than there were if they didn't have those slices in the pie. And I think many people in the UNHCR would agree with that. They're stuck because of the definitions that are in international law at the founding of the UN. And so I think one object of criticism needs to be that distinction at all. I mean, the idea that people can be born without existing legally at all in any way needs to be attacked really at the ground floor. Sorry, but I didn't mean to get into the middle of that, except that I think the definitions are really problematic. That would mean then that the refugees, internally displaced people, and the stateless people are in a sense all in the same very desperate place rather than in three different places.
What do we lose from having no definition of or differentiation between the groups?
Well, I think we have the differentiation between the groups for the same reasons that all of you have elaborated, namely that countries didn't want to feel responsible for internally displaced people within a country. And take Syria again as an example. The 7 million inside the country, as well as the 5 million that have gone across the border. I mean, it's a huge further economic and other imposition. And so I think the lines were drawn not to protect the displaced people, but to protect those that otherwise would have international responsibility for dealing with them. But so you got a clarification to your question. Other comments or questions from others?
I saw a lot of overlapping with the lack of registration in Jack's speech and my speech. I know, for example, in Somalia, there exists the single mother issue. So a lot of the people that are living in the Dadaab camp, not only can they not register because facilities were closed, but when they were open, they were struggling because rape is a very common issue for the women living within the camp. So when they were raped and they would have these children, the children would remain unregistered by the camp, and therefore they could not receive proper supplies to raise a child. That means not enough food for the child, no education, no even attempt at getting into any of the programs that I've mentioned. If there's no papers that can apply to get into any of the housing projects that I was mentioning in my speech.
Well, so I know that, for instance, like we talk about all the differentiation of these people, and we try as international bodies and as people looking at the issue, we try to find the best solutions for these people. But I think that what Matt brought up is something that we need to talk about, and I think that that might lead to a more interesting conversation of what do morals mean for someone trying to, or a body trying, or a country trying to help with the issue. Because when I talked I outlined the fact that I think the EU has a moral responsibility and countries have a moral responsibility of taking in refugees. And so that, let's assume that, or hopefully agree that that's something that that can be established. But before that, what are our morals, and how do we respond to something when, as a nation, we have, or as a body, we have our own interest to take into account?
Well, in my speech, I talked a lot about the United States as the world's largest power in the world. And I think that as the world's, only superpower at this point, we have a moral responsibility to take into account these people and these conflicts, because all these conflicts will do is affect us negatively, because the world is so connected. When people have to choose between, the United States and the Russians and the Russians who have no respect or regard for country sovereignties, or the Chinese who feel the very same way, I think that the United States needs to step up and be that sort of moral force in the world. As a whole, when I was looking at Dr. Rupp's chain that he sort of created, my problem with it is that I think it sort of implies that people living in conflict regions want to become integrated into European countries, which is certainly true, but I think what needs to be taken into account is the fact that nobody wants to leave their home. Nobody wants to be forced out of their ancestral homeland into another foreign nation. So I think that that's why solving these conflicts is very important, because all people want is to live comfortably in the place that their ancestors have lived for most of the time thousands of years. And when they're facing, drought, when they're facing war with little help from, international communities, I think that no one really wants to be put in that sort of situation.
Do we think that now, let's say that, I don't know, this is a stretch, but let's say that all the issues that we have in the Middle East and the conflicts that lead people right now and kind of force people to migrate weren't there. You believe in the assumption that the majority of those, or not obviously the majority, but you believe in the assumption that a lot of those people would not desire to move, because I think that a lot of that is based in a mentality that we had before our world became so connected, especially economically.
I mean, obviously that there's a lot of places where these people are coming from, and they're coming for, a better economic dream and a better economic hope. But I also think at the same time that people's ties to their homeland is something that's very ingrained in a lot of people's, families and their ancestry. And I think that what Mr. Rupp talked about in the very beginning, which was more international development in these regions, is the correct action to take. Because at the same time, it's not viable to have all of these people move into first world countries. And if you do take that as the solution to the problem, to move more and more of these people into first world countries, it makes sort of the dangerous assumption that you're just going to leave the people who are already there and the people who can't move behind.
Well, could I just make one observation about that? And then I think we should see whether, Wilson, you want to have a further comment now before we open it up, because it's almost 3:30 and I was told we should definitely involve the questions from the audience by 3:30. But I've managed to lose the point I wanted to make on the, sorry, so it'll come back to me in a minute. But Wilson, do you have further comments you want to make?
Yeah, I would just like to comment that I think that what Bianca and Matthew have been saying really does bring up this moral decision to be made on the part of the refugee as to whether or not they want their life and their culture to be westernized and incorporated into the European and American culture, or whether or not they would prefer to stay in their homeland, assuming it would be secure, which is why resolving those conflicts tends to be so important.
Okay, I did think of a comment I just wanted to make as a throwaway line. When we talk about if in fact, the contrary to fact hypothesis, everyone who wanted to could migrate to a first world country for a better economic future and all the rest of it, and that would then, the danger would be it would leave a lot of people unsupported in their homeland. One of the facts we have to remember is that reparations from migrants to their home country are 3 times as much money as all of the international development assistance combined. So I'm not suggesting that it would be good to have everybody leave those countries and move to a first world country, but it is not as if they get separated completely from their homeland. They in fact send back very large amounts of money. Given the fact that they're migrants or refugees with having to assimilate into a new country and so on, nonetheless, each year more money is repatriated through gifts from refugees to their homeland than all of the international relief and development put together. Just as an interesting factoid.
I just have one comment on that. Is it not dangerous, though, to have these economies of developing countries become entirely reliant upon repatriation and money from?
Of course.
Because, like, I mean, Eritrea, for instance, their entire economy is based on money sent from Europe.
I'm not suggesting that's a good model for the development of those countries. But it shows the interconnectedness even of those who leave their country and go to another country. And I guess if you calibrate the relative effectiveness of money returned by people to their own families and international development assistance, it'd be a tough call which of those is more effective. But we should open it up for questions from the floor for anyone on the panel. I was reliably informed that you're always full of questions.
I'd like to ask the panel, why should it be a moral imperative for the West to help refugees? Why can't we just say, I'm good where I am, I'm going to keep 99 cents out of my dollar, okay, and they should thank their lucky stars and willing to give them 1 penny? Why should it be a moral imperative for the richest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, which has been made by immigrants, differently from other countries that could vie to be number 2 or number 3, which basically have populations that were, through the generations, endemic. Chinese are Chinese, even though they're broken up by lots of ethnicities, but basically they didn't move far to be in present-day China. Same as the ex-Soviet Union or Russia. They didn't have an influx. Just look at the last names on the placards in front of you. Okay, who can raise their hand and say that they're Native American Indian? Okay, so your generations, your prior generations, the ones that are related to you, came from somewhere else as immigrants. Differently from what Dr. Carson, our Secretary of HED, said, the slave ships were populated by immigrants from Africa. Okay? So I'd like to hear from you guys and find out why you think we should help them. Is there a moral imperative to help them?
Well, I talked about, solving conflicts, and I think this goes into the same thing about the responsibility of the United States to protect these people. And I think as a whole, everyone in this room has something to gain by helping these people, because not only by helping these people does it build up American prestige as a whole, but everyone here gets value out of having a more stable world. And that's just the reality, is that the world today is so interconnected that having, a more stable place for these people to go, having, a more stable situation for people of the poorest nations, it will benefit people of the richer nations. It will show the world that the United States not only cares about them, which will benefit us economically in trade, but it also makes sure that these people do not end up in situations where they resent the West, where we get cut off from these countries, we get cut off from these cultures, and they even respond in conflict.
Anytime I hear someone debating, or I have heard someone or read something of someone debating why we don't have the moral responsibility to take on these refugees, they point out issues and details of how refugees can negatively impact the nation that they're coming into. But I often find myself asking, okay, so you have an issue with these people. You have an issue with these people coming into your nation. However, these people are not going away. So if you don't want them, what are we to do with this large amount of people? And I think that as a world, we can't just say, well, we don't care about them, or well, they cause an issue, so they're not my responsibility. If I think that if someone is to say that we don't have a moral responsibility, then they have to say what we are to do with these people, and what these people, what their fate has to be. Because obviously, as Matt talked about, we have to, as a nation and as a world, we want to promote a stable world, and we can't simply avoid and look the other way. And so I think that's the main issue I have with people questioning the moral responsibility we have to tackle any humanitarian crisis, but especially this one.
I mean, I would also like to point out that from a more domestic perspective, the United States specifically does have this moral responsibility because it's so written into our history. We saw it with the Quakers of Pennsylvania, the Catholics of Maryland, and the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, that the United States has always been a haven for those who have been persecuted, and I believe that should be continued through today.
One thing I would like to bring up is that the United States has a moral responsibility to help these people in some capacity, whether it's taking them in or helping to stabilize their countries, because we're directly involved in some parts in destabilizing them, like Libya, for instance. We were involved in overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, for better or for worse, so we have a responsibility to help stabilize that country and help the people of it.
Well, and you could certainly carry that forward with, we certainly destabilized Iraq, from which lots of refugees came. But I think if the only honest answer to your question would be that I think for the vast majority of us, in the end, this moral responsibility is anchored in some kind of religious interpretation of obligation. And it can be framed very differently in Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and other humanistic ways, but that there is some encompassing obligation for the benefit of people who are in need. And I'm most comfortable putting that in Christian or Buddhist terms, but it can be put in lots of other terms. The other comment I would like to make is that if only people were willing to go with you on 1%, it'd be a terrific gain. It'd be 5 times as much as being given of your resources now. Instead of 2 cents on $10, it'd be 1 cent on $1 or 10 cents on $10. So keep on pushing the 1%, even if if you don't believe it's morally obligated. Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment, and maybe the panel would like to comment, on the cutbacks that are proposed for foreign aid and USAID by the current administration, and whether you think that's going to harm our position in the world, and also the effects it would have on refugees and our support.
First off, did everyone hear his question? Okay.
Well, I will try to be brief because I'm sure the panel will want to comment on it as well. But I think it's horrific. I only gestured in that direction by asking, what would these numbers look like in 2020 compared to 2016? I mean, the numbers for international assistance and so on. But the current Trump administration proposals happily will be dead on arrival because there is a two-party constituency in Congress that will find it unacceptable simply to zero out USAID or international exchange programs. That's also part of the proposal. But very concretely, in the case of refugees, the Trump administration has, as you know, first of all, implemented a 120-day suspension of any admission of refugees. So people who may have waited 18, 20 years were about ready to go, and now we're told it's all suspended. And this is not theoretical. We've got the IRC has people on the ground working in places like the Dab, working every day with people who all of a sudden are told, sorry, we don't know what's going to happen after 120 days, but no one's going anywhere for 120 days. They've also agreed to, they've also proposed that the presidentially mandated ceiling be dropped from the 100,000 that it was under the Obama administration to 50,000 in the first year, without any assurance of what happens after that. So these, if you allow these kinds of proposals, if they were to be implemented, to go on for a couple of years, there is a dramatic result in the really evisceration of programs that the U.S. government has long since been committed to. The single largest government donor to the UN High Commission of Refugees is the United States. So if that gets zeroed out, which my prediction is, at least the proposal will be also to zero out the U.S. contribution to the UN, that will have major catastrophic consequences for all of the refugees who are now in camps getting very minimal and inadequate support, but all of a sudden it will be even more inadequate. So this whole range of issues is going to be very ugly to watch. And as I say, I think that the proposals from the administration will be dead on arrival, but that means that there will have to be a continuing resolution in order to just keep things afloat, which will take forever to get through the Congress, with complete uncertainty about what funding will be for any of these programs after the continuing resolution expires. So it will be very ugly. And an organization like the International Rescue Committee is right now, we have resettlement offices in 29 cities in this country. Without having a refugee flow and State Department funding for helping to resettle those, there's no way of keeping that infrastructure in place. And let me give you a comparison. After 9/11, there was a similar catastrophic, apprehension about refugees, and the Bush administration quite understandably said, we got to stop any inflow of refugees until we get a better handle on all of this. But when we went to them and said, we've got the refugee resettlement enterprise in this country is undertaken by 10 agencies that work with the State Department. The IRC is the only one that is not religiously based. All the others are affiliated with religious organizations. And they all have an infrastructure, various parts around the country. So we went in and said to the administration, if this, in the interim, we're going to have to lay off staff. We're going to have to basically undermine the network across the country that's been built up. And the Bush administration said, no, don't do that. We'll provide funding independent of refugee admissions, not on a per capita basis as it had been done in the past, just so you can maintain the infrastructure that will allow resettlement of refugees to take up again once we get over the kind of angst and apprehension. But that's because the Bush administration had responsible people who in the long run thought that this long tradition of resettling refugees was admirable and would be resumed. It's not at all obvious that that's present in the current administration. And so it's completely unclear what will happen to that infrastructure after there's some kind of agreement that gets out of Congress.
I want to ask you something, and I know that this is I'm dramatizing the issue, and I hope that we never get to what my question is asking. But I know that, so you've outlined what the U.S. might do and the trajectory that it is going on. But what happens if other all the other other nations who are supporting the United Nations, France with Marine Le Pen, Germany with the rise of the AfD, what happens if a lot of those nations who are the largest contributors to international bodies back away from their commitment to them? How is our international responsibility? Do we have a check and balance to our international
There is no check and balance on that front. I think that the initial reaction in much of the developed world, and I would include here Japan and China, as well as Europe, has been that they will step into the void that the U.S. leaves. It's not obvious. I mean, if Marine Le Pen wins in France, that's a whole different question. But there's no question, even with the Conservative victory and the Brexit vote in the UK, there's very strong commitment to these sorts of global obligations in the UK. There certainly is in Canada. There certainly is in Germany, and I think the odds that the right wing in Germany will win are virtually non-existent. Yes. I mean, so that I think what will happen is, and not that there won't be huge costs, because there's no way these countries can absorb, can make all of the increase if there are major cuts, even just in the U.S., but the U.S. and one or two other countries that wind up being taken over by, right-wing authoritarian governments. But so the ones who stay with the kind of consensus that the Marshall Plan really set, I mean the pattern that it set starting after World War II, they will try to pick up some of the slack, but there will be very major costs, and certainly within this country, but also internationally, because even though the U.S. is extremely stingy on a per capita or a per dollar basis of GDP compared to the Danes or the Germans or and almost any other developed country. In fact, any other developed country. We still give large amounts of money just because we have a very large and strong economy. And so that is going to be a very big problem. Even if Le Pen does not win.
Does the public have any other questions?
Can I touch on that question? I'm sorry. I would just like to provide a real-life example of the benefits of continuing U.S. aid. In the Dadaab refugee camp was being threatened to being closed down in 2016 by the Kenyan government, and they cited possible terrorist threats. Clearly, there was international outrage at the possibility of having to move 500,000 people back into an unstable country, with many of these people not even having citizenship and being stateless. And the U.S. was able to negotiate with the Kenyan government to stall this for 6 more months. Without U.S. giving aid to Kenya and to this camp, we would have no say in what was happening to the refugees. So to simplify, if we stop trying to better the lives of the refugees, we lose our say in what's happening in the crisis and in the lives of millions of people internationally. We weaken ourselves as a country and on the international scale by not giving aid to these people.
Yeah, I've been in Dadaab a number of times, and if in fact those Somali refugees in the Dadaab camp are forced to go back into Somalia, there is going to be an enormous slaughter of people going back into that country.
I would just like to when I was doing my research, the main reason people cited for not wanting to go back to Somalia was being forced to join militant groups, and the second one was being raped because there's no legal protection there for women, and there's hardly a government currently.
Yeah, I was in my topic when I was talking about conflicts and the roots of conflicts. In a situation in Somalia happened where, droughts affected a lot of the more nomadic people who were living in the countryside, and without any livestock to support them, they're forced into cities. And when they get to cities, there's no jobs there, and those jobs push people to join militant groups, which only makes the situation worse, or they'll flee into the nearby country. I don't want to see a world without United States aid or United States leadership, because that situation will only get worse. Only if the United States was there to provide more aid, like Mr. Rupp has been talking about, maybe there could be more jobs programs for these people who are pushed into cities, or even more programs to help preserve their sort of agricultural way of life in the face of, the threats of climate change.
And to add to what Matthew was saying, through the MSF findings, 60% of those interviewed, the 1,000 refugees I mentioned in my speech, cited the drought as their reason for leaving Somalia. It deplenished the remaining people that were remaining in Somalia and the economy there.
Ms. Youngblood?
So I'm just going to recapture the question so we can pick it up on the mic, because without the mic it doesn't pick up. So it sounds to me like the question is connecting the climate change and its impact, forgetting if it's man-made or a natural thing, but in terms of its real-world implications, what have you guys come across in terms of climate change and the impact that has on this topic? Did I get that right, Ms. Youngblood?
Well, at least in my research, I found it had a huge impact on the Somali refugees that were coming into Kenya. As I stated previously, 60% cited the drought as their primary reason for leaving. Without a strong agriculture segment in developing nations, you're going to see an increase in refugees leaving their nation because, as Matthew was saying before, they're forced to go to cities. They either become refugees or they join militant groups. Either way, those are not ideal situations.
I think in the world today, there's nothing more dangerous than someone who can't feed their family or who can't feed themselves. It's a situation like that that pushes people to join jihadist groups, that pushes people to take up arms and fight when they feel like their government has abandoned them. And in your hypothetical, you said, let's say all the political, tensions were rid of. In that case, what do most people want? They want land, they want peace, and they want bread. And without any land to grow food on, without any bread to eat, and it'll push them to fight. And that's exactly what happened in Syria, which is why Syria is considered one of the first sort of climate wars. It's what happened in Somalia, it's what happened in Yemen, and it's also what happened in Libya to some extent. When we see so many different conflicts being worsened and started by droughts, by sort of, the effects of climate change, I feel like it should be more at the forefront of where our aid is going and this discussion. And the fact that right now we have an administration that denies the existence of climate change makes me very worried for how we're going to combat the sources of these conflicts.
I would just like to add, in Somalia currently, the UN just released a statement that 3 million people there are at risk of malnutrition and starvation due to the 2016 Somali drought.
Well, since Somalia has come up again and again, I can't help connecting it to another set of issues that we haven't talked very much about, namely the illusion that by rapidly increasing military investments in the military, we can sort of ward off some of these problems. And I'll use the example of Somalia. I was in the Assistant Secretary of State's office in Washington at the time that the Ethiopians were considering going into Somalia in order to overthrow the moderate Islamic government that was then there, the Islamic courts. And I was there with another aid official, another head of an international development organization, to try to persuade the State Department that that was a mistake. The Ethiopians, if they were encouraged to enter Somalia militarily, would simply destabilize the country in ways that would just draw on the animosities between Somalia and Ethiopia, which go back centuries. And I could tell from the way in which the State Department official was talking to us that the decision had already been made. They were encouraged the Ethiopians to go in, and in fact they did within really a couple of days of when we were there, and had exactly the perverse effect that, namely, the Islamic court government, not great, but had support of the local population, And if it had been supported and given significant economic development assistance, could have addressed some of the issues that, in fact, were completely unaddressed because there was just more fighting as the drought came in. And so I just want to underscore that point because we now have an administration that thinks all we have to do is increase by 40 or 50 billion dollars the defense budget and everything's going to be okay, and we'll pay for it by taking away the other ways in which we can have a positive impact in the world.
I would also like to comment on Mrs. Youngblood's question by saying that we have had a lot of focus on this panel about people displaced by conflict, but it's also important to note that many refugees are not displaced by conflict and instead displaced by natural disaster, as we have stated with the drought with Somalia. And I think it's important to note that climate change can very well cause further natural disasters, not having anything to do with conflict, that can still perpetuate the refugee crisis.
The only slight caveat I would put on that is, in most cases, the climate change is intimately involved with conflict within that country. I mean, certainly that was the case in Somalia, which again, the drought before the 2011 one, Ethiopia had suffered very seriously from the same drought, and there was major investment with the support of the Ethiopian government, but also by the U.S., the UN, other countries, in developing water resources and not wasting water within Ethiopia. And when the next drought hit, the Ethiopians suffered almost no casualties, whereas Somalia was decimated in the way in which you've described. And that's partly because there was no investment. All the investment was in different factions fighting each other in Somalia. And that was exacerbated by having the Ethiopians go in. Sorry, that's more than you want to know about Somalia, but it's...
Yeah, I was just going to say that on the topic...
You were going to just say that you didn't want to hear any more about Somalia.
I was actually going to just mention Somalia because on this topic of, natural disaster, I refuse to believe that there are a lot of truly evil people in this world. But there are a lot of desperate people, and desperate people are constantly taken advantage on by these sorts of evil individuals, and there's nothing that breeds desperate people more than natural disaster. And that's the situation in Somalia, and that's the situation in a lot of places in the Middle East.
I also think that when we talk about, the crisis at hand, is that we often, and the U.S. and the European Union are guilty of this equally, of trying to fund and find short-term solutions to what we see as the problem and as the conflict. And however, I think the main issue with that is that we don't realize that, as I mentioned, the refugee crisis isn't a one-off event, and that is exacerbated by what we're talking about now, which is climate change. The main reason why we know that it's not a one-off event, why we need to have long-term policy, is because we know that this isn't going to wait even if we fix what's going on in Syria.
I have an observation. If you look at the Native American population in this country, are they any better than any refugee in the world? They live in isolated and desolate reservations. There are no jobs, very minimal health care, rampant crime. What you just described exists in refugee camps throughout the world. If we cannot help the people of our own country that in fact are in refugee camps, how can we expect to help people in the world?
You said that was an observation rather than a question. Look, I think it's a very telling observation, and I think the United States has much to be ashamed of in the way in which we've dealt with the Native American population in this country, and the extent to which those who remain on reservations, which is a small fraction of the Native American population that was here, are very inadequately cared for and need to be better educated, trained, in order to be able to take care of themselves in ways that they do not now, are not now able to do. But yeah, it's a good point. We could start there and see if we can do a reasonable job with our own captive populations.
Maybe do one or two more questions. I'll let Bianca, you can.
Go ahead, sorry.
So we've been talking about interconnectivity
stabilizes the world population. So I'm wondering from the panel what their opinion is on the current isolation stance, or why are we looking at globalization as an evil thing? And if you have any ideas of how to move beyond that.
So the question is, it appears that we are sort of running away from a globalized world that we're in, and so the question came up about trade in the globalized world, and maybe why we're running away from it, and some solutions or responses to that sort of movement.
I would like to comment on this, if that's okay. So I think the isolationist reaction that we're seeing today is a result of the inequalities of globalization. It's easy to sit here in Washington, Connecticut and say that globalization is great for everyone. But there are definitely there's backlash for sure to globalization in our own country and in Europe and everywhere else, even in the developing world. So, for instance, you see the Rust Belt, for instance, a great example. They've not necessarily been benefited by globalization at all. And regardless of whether those jobs would have been lost anyway due to automation, globalization has only sped up the process of these regions declining economically. So I think while globalization does benefit a lot of people, the majority of people, there are certainly a lot of people that have been forgotten by globalization. And those people are the people we need to address now if we don't want to see growing nationalism and isolationism.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the benefits of globalization are something that I think everyone in this room takes for granted, and they're things that are less easy to track down than its negatives. It's very easy for someone in the Rust Belt to see car manufacturing jobs moving to China or Japan and say, that's why my job's gone. Why do we have, this sort of globalization system? Why do we keep investing in other countries? But people are less likely to, talk about the benefits of so many jobs on the global market, how cheap goods are in America because of globalization. People are less likely to see that than they are to see, losing your own job to, a far-off factory.
Well, I agree with Matthew on what he said, but I also want to talk about that. I don't know how many of you were here last year, but exactly a year ago, we were all sitting here talking about the relationship between globalization and security. That was a topic last year. And despite our differences, I think all of us, including the speaker at the time, were talking about how globalization on a whole positively impacts our security. And that aside, and all those details aside, I think that between a year ago and now, I don't necessarily think that what is happening is that we're moving away from our globalized world. I think that in a lot of ways, we appreciate our globalized world in most of its aspects, and we praise it in most of its aspects, at least the politicians we have who are aware of what Matt was talking about, the benefits of it. I think what we see is that people, in regards to the migrant crisis, in regards to refugees, in regards to immigrants, they're turning away from globalization. But I think that I hope that in the majority of all other aspects of globalization, we're not turning away. And that's why I see a contradiction between how we're handling our immigration and our refugee policies. I think that's the biggest highlight of globalization not being supported. So I don't know, do we think that globalization as a whole is being shunned, or do we think that it is our migrant policies which don't correspond with how we're looking at globalization in a more general sense and are kind of moving us towards pushing for a less globalized world?
Well, I think it's also important to point out the fact that globalization does also impact the undeveloped world. So for instance, you see Western companies going into countries like Mozambique, for instance, and tearing down rainforests and stuff. And they're able to do that in a lot of ways because of Western banks and monetary organizations loaning money to these countries at high interest rates. So in a lot of ways, the refugee crisis and immigration as a whole is because of globalization. So I think we need to just totally rethink the way we see globalization and change it in a lot of ways to better our own citizens and also the citizens of the underdeveloped world.
Well, I would like to say that I think one of the reasons that globalism has become so unpopular in America is that it completely contradicts the foundational idea of American exceptionalism. Because if you agree with globalism, you also agree that then you are now a global citizen rather than just an American citizen. There is a foundational difference.
Yeah, and personally, I completely agree with what Bridget just said, and I don't think that in most ways it is good for us to rethink the way we look at globalization to move into what ends up being effectively American exceptionalism.
Because if you agree with globalization, then it's no longer just about the betterment of America, it's the betterment of everyone else. And that means sacrificing some of our own exceptionalism.
To just provide kind of an opposite scenario from what Jack presented about cutting down rainforests in Africa in response to globalization, I would also like to point out that globalization is what feeds many people in Africa. It is what enables many people living in otherwise inhabitable areas to survive. And for those reasons, I feel like you need to see it from both sides of the argument.
Yeah, and to build on what Wilson just said, I also want to state that this is another idea that I've been stressing about the importance of United States aid and United States intervention, is that when the United States goes into a region to build up its infrastructure, they follow up on their loans and their investments more reliably than other world powers like Russia and China would. You know, we have a situation where the Chinese are moving into a lot of African nations and building infrastructure, but the infrastructure that's being built there isn't very good at all. And it just, ends up making these countries have these loans that they can't pay off, which is why it was another reason why I supported, more United States intervention.
So it's 4 o'clock, believe it or not. This can continue. We're very fortunate that the Shepaug Student Project Foundation has supported some refreshments for us. The panelists will be available. Dr. Rupp will be available. If anyone, I know a few of you had questions. I'm sorry about that. But certainly the panelists would be open to continuing the conversation maybe in a more informal way. So I personally want to first just tip my hat to everyone. Thank you so much for your time, preparation, and thoughts. Dr. Rupp, especially for agreeing to be our speaker this year. You were wonderful in moderating the discussion and offered penetrating insights. Bianca, you did a phenomenal job this is just part of her senior project. In years past, students have done the Model UN as their senior project, and another student has done the World Affairs Forum as their senior project. Bianca took both of these and more and made it her senior project, so you did an absolutely wonderful job, and we're very proud of you. So I hope you'd like to stick around. If there's coffee, iced tea, some refreshments. I'd also like to just let you guys know that each student received Dr. Rupp's book, Beyond Individualism, The Challenges of Inclusive Communities. We're also donating one to each town library and this library. So if anyone would like to go and read it, it'll be there. So I'm going to turn it over just to Bianca real quick to sum it up, and then we'll look forward to seeing people if they choose to stick around. Thank you for attending.
Well, Mr. Dennis said pretty much all I wanted to say, but I asked him to lend the mic over to me just because I want to thank everyone who was able to come and thank Dr. Rupp, and more than everything, really thank my panelists because they dealt with me and each other locked down for 2 days to prepare for this, and that's a lot. So. Thank you to everyone, and I'm so happy and privileged that this is part of what I get to actually put as a grade in my grade book, which is so weird to me that I actually get graded for this. I do this because I like it, and I think everyone here shares that. So thank you.